Councilmember Rouse?
Here.
Councilmember Hotchkiss?
Here.
Councilmember Murillo?
All right, very good. And we have the item of the new zoning ordinance to read. Would you read the item, please?
New zoning ordinance recommendation that the ordinance committee recommend to City Council adoption of the following. Recommendation A, amendments to Title 28, zoning ordinance and zoning map. Title 29, airport zoning ordinance and airport zoning map. Specific plan 9, Veronica Meadows. Title 9, public peace and safety. Title 22, environmental policy and construction. Title 27, subdivisions, and related titles of the Santa Barbara Municipal Code. Recommendation B, amendment to the general plan map to designate the Veronica Meadows Specific Plan Area A, 1425 Las Positas Road, APN number 047-010-064 and 047-010-065 as parks open space from hillside low-density residential, max 2 dwelling units per acre, and designate an adjacent lot, APN 047-061-026, as parks open space from hillside low-density residential, max 3 dwelling units per acre, and suburban low-density residential, max 3 dwelling units per acre. And recommendation C, amendments to the certified local coastal program for all proposed changes in the coastal zone.
Thank you. And we have a staff report. So, Mr. Caddo, if you would please.
Thank you, Chair Rouse. We're here today, this morning, at our special ordinance committee meeting to hear staff presentation and hopefully make recommendations to City Council on the new zoning ordinance. Yay!
You may be the only one cheering here.
So for those of you following along in TV land, on the slide here we have some links to our website. If you have a QR reader on your smartphone, you can use that little square on the side and that'll take you directly to santabarbaraca.gov/NZO. If you go to the public hearing section, you can have all the documents that are under review today. So I'm going to be giving a staff presentation. Hopefully we'll be having some public comment and then discussion and review by the ordinance committee, and then hopefully a recommendation by the ordinance committee to council. My presentation will be these 8 items: objectives, timeline, organization, major topics, environmental review, recommendations, and next steps. When we started out with this project, and there were objectives that were laid out, there are 6 of them up here: consistency with the general plan, restructuring to be concise and easier to understand, modernized, clear decision-making protocols, addressing non-conforming situations, and promoting adaptive reuse of properties. 4 considerations: balancing protections of neighborhoods, limited growth, and economic vitality, ease of application, regulations that reflect the community's values, and development standards that are consistent with other parts of the municipal code. City Council initiated the zoning ordinance update in 2014. Actually, was adopted as part of the capital improvements program in 2013. Between 2014 and now, there's been a lot of work by staff. As we started out, we started with about 15 different meetings with interested parties, from AIA to Allied to Mesa Architects, Chamber of Commerce, et cetera, to let them know this effort's going on, to beg them to be involved, and et cetera. We hired a consultant to help us do this project, and based on her advice, we divided the review of the new zoning ordinance into 3 modules, which we had hearings in 2015 and 2016. Module 1 was land use regulations, Module 2 was development standards, and Module 3 administration, parking, and temporary uses. For each one of those modules, we held an open house down at the Gebhardt Room at 630 Garden Street, and that's us talking to the public about these things. In 2017, we released the draft of the new zoning ordinance. That was February of 2017. We held 2 open houses, and we held 3 planning commission hearings, and the planning commission ended those hearings with a recommendation for adoption to City Council. Those open houses were held at the Faulkner Gallery. A couple of photos showing us talking to the public about these things. Next, I'm going to talk about the organization of the new zoning ordinance. So these 4 bullet points up here are what we did, right? The vast majority is changes to wording, formatting, and location without changing the content. Second, content was changed for ease of use, better readability, that sort of thing. Codifications of existing policies and procedures, and then lastly, new or changed standards. The ENZO's divided up into 5 different divisions: introductory, zone regulations, citywide regulations, admin and permits, and general terms. I'll go over each of those ones quickly. Division 1 is introductory provisions, like what is the zoning ordinance, what is its purpose, that sort of thing. A table that shows what the different zone classifications are and what to do when zone boundaries change, that sort of thing. And then 2 new sections that are pretty cool. First is rules of construction of language. We've never had that in the code before, but this is the thing that says should means advisory, shall means regulatory, required, that sort of thing. And then rules of measurement. This is how do you measure a setback? How do you measure building height? You know, what's the closest property? That sort of thing. And right now in the code, they're spread out all over the place in definitions and standards, wherever. And pull them into one spot so it's easy to find how to measure things. Another cool thing about the ENZO is diagrams. Our current code does not have any diagrams. The new code has, the ENZO proposes about 70 different diagrams because, as we all know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is just an example determining the number of stories in a building. Division 2 is the zone regulations. This is divided into 3 parts: the base zones, overlay zones, and specific plan zones. This is the zoning map of the city. It doesn't really change much. I'll talk about one thing in a minute. It doesn't change much except the names of the zone designations. Almost all of the zone designations names are proposing to be changed to be more intuitive, to be more understood what it's about, instead of these random letters. Not quite random, but you know what I mean. First, the base zones. They're residential, commercial and office, manufacturing, coastal-oriented, and parks and recreation. First one I'll talk about are residential single-unit zones. I still call this single-family zones. I probably will for a long time because that's just how I know them, but it's one house on a lot, residential single unit. That's the new name. This table shows the proposed changes. In the center column is the current designation, right? A1, A2, E1, E2, E3, and R1, which don't mean really anything to anybody because you don't know what that's talking about. But the way it works is the single-family zone designations are based on the minimum lot size, and that's in this third column here. So what we've done in the single-family zones and all other zones, we tried to make the first or second letter of the zone title to be indicative of generally what we're talking about. So R stands for residential, S stands for single unit, and then this is the unit, the lot size, right? 1 acre, 25,000 square feet, 10,000 square feet, et cetera. So hopefully this makes it a little bit easier for people to understand what the purpose of these different zones are. In residential multi-unit zones, the R2 zone is one of...
Excuse me, just a quick question.
Yeah,
What
sure.
if a lot falls between 2 of those designations? Which do you use?
Well, they're already there, so they already have a zone, right? So
Oh, so you just convert it to what is there?
yeah, and the zone, a zone, how can I say this? A lot size is completely independent from the zone designation. You could have a E3 lot with a 7,500 square foot minimum lot size, but it could be 4,000 square feet, or it could be 20,000 square feet, right? It's just these vast swaths of land, as you can see up here. Like this whole area here is what we consider E1, which is RS 15,000, right? So in between there, it just depends on how the lot was subdivided originally or since, but most of them are in that range that you see. So R2 zone is one of the few zones that's not changing name. Residential, 2-family residence, 2-unit residential. But R3, limited multifamily residence, turns to RM, residential multi-unit, and then R4 hotel, motel, multiple residence becomes RMH, residential multi-unit and hotel. So a little clearer for people. And this is probably the single coolest thing in the whole document right here. Because what I'm showing you here are on the right, this is the existing code. This is the uses permitted in the single family zones. So one type of zone, it's very text heavy, right? What the type of uses are allowed. And there's one of these for the R2 zone, the R3 zone, and the R4 zone. So imagine 4 pages of this condensed into what you see on the left, which is this table. Right now, we have the different zones, RS, all the residential single unit zones, R2, RM, and RMH across these columns, and then these land use classifications like single unit residential, 2-unit residential, going down the side. And then you can see from this table what's allowed and what's not allowed and what needs special permission, right? A stands for allowed use. It's allowed by right. This dash means it's not allowed. PSP means it's allowed with a performance standard permit, which is like a mini CUP. And then CUP means conditional use permit. So you can see quickly how the RMH zone allows like quite a number of more things than the single unit residential zones do. And then also just for point of clarification, some of these uses have specific restrictions, and those have a little number that refers you to a number at the bottom of this table. And then there could be additional regulations. I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but this refers you to a different part of the code that says, okay, there's special things about accessory dwelling units that you need to go to look at for this other part of the code. So 4 pages of text-heavy, dense reading turns into this very easy-to-read table, and that is awesome. Seriously. Similarly, development standards, it's the same thing. We've put as much as we could into tables. This is the lot area and frontage requirements of the single-family zones. Again, very text-heavy, and then there's also a required multiplication down here if you have a different slope. The steeper the slope, the bigger your lot, and you have to calculate it, right? Now, all that is in this table, right? The different zone, now these are the different single unit residential zones here, and then the slopes across here, and we've done the math for you. Awesome. So anyway, this will make it so much easier to read for the public and for us. Make it easier to understand. Commercial and office zones, again, we've taken RO, restricted office, and turned it into O, right? First letter being the main thing, office, restricted. CO is medical office, although who knows what the C stands for. Turns that into OM, office medical. There are 3 limited or restricted commercial zones, CP, CL, and C1. Enzo proposes to convert those into a single zone type because they are about 95, 99% the same. And then C2 becomes CG, general commercial. I was talking about those 3 zones, CP, CL, and C1, which are being proposed as CR, commercial restricted. You can see them here in this sort of terracotta brownish color. C1 is Coast Village Road over here. There's another piece of C1 up at Foothill Triangle. Almost all the rest of this that you see in brown is CP. There's only 4 CL zone lots in the whole city. So those are proposed to be combined into a single zone CR. Manufacturing zones, again, we're trying to put M first for manufacturing. So instead of CM, we switch the order MC. M1 becomes MI for manufacturing industrial. Coastal zones, they range HRC 1 and 2, HCOC and OM1. We're starting them all out with CO, coastal oriented. And then hotel and restaurant, hotel and visitor serving, harbor, commercial arts and recreation, manufacturing industrial. Again, we're trying to make it all regular and make it easier, more intuitive. Parks and Rec, the big change here is we're putting a hyphen in between the 2 letters. So there are overlay zones in the city, and those are listed on the right-hand side. PD stands for planned development, but no one knows what that means. But this is the Rancho Arroyo area, and it's mostly auto, commercial, and services. So we're proposing to change that to ACS. SD3 stands for Special District 3, which is the coastal zone, but nobody knows that except those that know it. So we're changing that to CZ, coastal zone. CX is research and development. Why? Don't know, but RD seems more intuitive. SD1, Special District 1, is San Roque Park, and SD2 is Upper State Street Area, USS. So those are proposed changes to the zone titles. There are 9 specific plan zones in the city, even though this one ends at SP10, because there was an SP3 at one time, but it was rescinded. But these designations are just these numbers. You don't know which one's which. What Enzo proposes is to add 1 or 2 letters to help people figure out what we're talking about, right? PP for Parks Plaza, WC for Westmount College, H for Hospital, LP, Los Portales. There are some proposed changes out of the airport, mostly because what we're doing in the rest of Enzo. I talked about the CR zone, the combination of those 3 zones into one. So it turns out that there's already a CR zone out at the airport. It's called Commercial Recreation. Now, they're in 2 separate titles. We could have kept them the same, but to reduce confusion, we decided that we would add the A, so ACR, out at the airport for Airport Commercial Recreational. And like the rest of town, SD3 becomes CZ for Coastal Zone, and we add the AI onto the SB6 for Airport Industrial Area. Division 3 includes all citywide regulations. General site regulations like open yard, encroachments into setbacks, solar, a few other things like that. AUD is in Division 3. Regulations on non-conforming structures, site development, and uses are in Division 3, as are parking regulations, and then the standards for specific uses. Remember I showed you in that table before, in the last column, it said C section, whatever. That refers you to Division 3. Division 4 is admin and permits. Planning authorities, that's like who does what, right? What does the council have purview over? What does the planning commission have purview over? What does the community development director have purview over? That sort of thing. And then all the procedures on how to process projects through our process, right? And a lot of them are the same. For example, coastal permits, conditional use permits, and development plan, they have virtually the same process. So wherever we could, we turn that into a section called common procedures. So this is just what everybody does. Noticing is the same for all these, mostly. And then if there are specific requirements for individual permit types, then those would be in the chapters about those types. For example, coastal permits have special processing, they have special noticing, they have special findings to be made, and those are different than the findings for a conditional use permit. So those things that are different are in these different specific permit type chapters. And then Division 5, use classifications and definitions. Again, right now, the uses that are allowed in the zones, they're just lists of uses in the zones with no real explanation of what they are. Like, what is an ice house? What is a tea house? That sort of thing. It's just lists. What the use classification does is kind of combine them a lot of things into like food service or retail, and then it gives lists, it gives descriptions of the types of things that would be included in that land use classification. And then lastly, definitions. And most of those come from the existing code. Some of them have been changed a little bit. Wherever there were regulations and definitions, we pulled them out and made them their own. So definitions are really only defining terms. Now, a couple things that are proposed that you don't see in your bound version of the ENZO, because we're going to be making those changes between Ordinance Committee and Council. The first is we're proposing to change the title from 28 to 30. And there's a couple of reasons that we want to do this. One is that the zoning ordinance has been titled 28 since 1974. So since 1974, there's all kinds of correspondence and reports and what have you that refer to Title 28 as the zoning ordinance and the current standards, right? Going forward in the future, if we were just to replace the current zoning ordinance with the new zoning ordinance, keeping it in Title 28, but all new numbers, all new everything. Think 20 years in the future, someone's doing some research to figure out, well, when did the rules change, and how come this is 2878 versus 2803 or whatever. Keeping it in title, or putting in Title 30 would make a clear delineation, right? At this point in time, we're talking about the regulations in Title 30. Before this point in time, Title 28. So it'll be easier for people to trace back history in the future. And the second reason is that these regulations of ENZO would not go into effect in the coastal zone until such time as the Coastal Commission approves the local coastal program amendment. And that can take a couple of years. So in between that time, if we have a Title 30 for the inland portion, non-coastal zone, and keep the Title 28 that we have as in the coastal zone, then it's very clear for those people that are in the coastal zone what they can and can't do. So that's two reasons that we are proposing a new Title 30. The other change, I don't know if you noticed, but these chapters are numbered consecutively, right? 2801, 2802. But they're also in alphabetical order. And if we ever want to insert things in new ordinances in the future, new chapters, we want to be able to do that. So instead of numbering consecutively, they're going to be numbered by fives. So you'll see that in the council version. But the language isn't proposing to change, just the numbering scheme. There are changes to other titles, and primarily the noise ordinance in Title 9, design review regulations in Title 22, and subdivision validity periods in Title 27 that need to be changed because of items that are in ENZO. And then there's references all over the municipal code to Title 28 as a zoning ordinance, and those have to be updated to Title 28 or Title 30. And so what you see in the ordinance that's attached to your package that shows references to Title 28, but between now and council, we'll add in the references to Title 30. There were a lot of major topics discussed by the Planning Commission. 5 of them are in the body of the Ordinance Committee report. I'm going to talk about those, and then I'm going to talk about several that were not in the body of the report, but were in Attachment 7. So let's start with these 5. Parking requirements for food service uses, narrowing the range of allowed uses in the MI zone, new parkland of Veronica Meadows, mobile food vendors, and accessory dwelling units. So parking for food service uses was the single most controversial topic in the whole shebang. It took the most public comment, the most discussion by the ENZO Joint Committee and the Planning Commission. And
food vendors, we're talking primarily restaurants?
Restaurants, fast food restaurants, anyone that serves food, bakeries, retail food service, that kind of thing. I'll describe what the issue is. Right now, we have 3 different parking rates for various types of food service uses. Right, a sit-down restaurant, including bars and tasting rooms, that's 1 space per 250 square feet, or 1 space per 3 seats, whichever is greater. It's almost always 1 per 3 seats, which is greater. And the second is fast food restaurants. Fast food restaurants have a parking requirement of 1 space per 100 square feet. And then retail food service, if you're not a restaurant, you're not serving food to consume, then you're 1 space per 250 square feet. Like a bakery that only sells bread to take away, that would be a retail food service use, right? A grocery store is a retail food service use. So the problem is, how do we differentiate between these different food service uses? Now, it turns out from the current zoning standards, the difference between a fast food restaurant and a sit-down restaurant is the type of plates that you serve on. If you serve on disposable plates like paper plates or edible containers like an ice cream cone, that's fast food. If you serve on non-disposable plates, that's a sit-down restaurant, right? What's the difference between retail food service and a restaurant? If you have a bakery and you just sell bread to go, your retail food service, but if you put in an espresso machine, then suddenly you're something else, right? You could be fast food or sit-down restaurant, depending on how you serve your food. So we spend a lot of time, applicants spend a lot of time with us, I should say, detailing their operation. Like, what kind of plates do you serve on? Do you have a dishwasher? Because if you don't have a dishwasher, then you're probably serving on disposable plates. Do you have an espresso machine? A lot of granular detail about an operation, which could change from month to month once you open, and so it can be very difficult, time consuming, and it's not super customer friendly. So the Enzo proposes a single parking rate for all those types of uses. Any type of food service would be a single rate. That way you don't have to ask these questions about how do you serve your food? Do you have an espresso machine? That sort of thing. It would eliminate the per seat parking rate, which is also counting number of seats and then having a restaurant comply with that number of seats. That's a tough one, because we find that people put in as many seats as they need to operate their business, regardless of what the number of parking spaces that they have. It also reduces uncertainty and discussions and negotiations between us and the applicants when we're talking about their food service business. Now, the central business district and the commercial shopping centers would not be affected because they already have a single rate for all uses. So it's only for areas outside the CBD, outside of shopping centers. Now, so this discussion at the Planning Commission, we had 3 hearings in March and April. This took up the probably 3/4 of one and one whole, so 1 3/4 of the meetings were devoted to this topic at the Planning Commission. They heard something on the order of 25 public comments, and after something like 3 to 4 hours of discussion, they came to a recommendation of 1 space per 250 square feet.
Mr. Cato, so
Yes.
I was on the subcommittee, and if I'm remembering, the conversation was pretty smooth at the subcommittee level. You're saying when it went to Planning Commission, that's when people noticed what we were up to?
Well, no. Okay, so here's what happened. When we went forward to the joint committee, we had some discussions among staff, and we thought we were all on the same page. It turns out that we weren't on the same page about what the parking requirement should be.
Okay.
So even though it turned out to be pretty smooth at the joint committee, once we kept going with that discussion, we took it to the Planning Commission. We had a much more robust discussion about what are the differences and what are the pros and cons of the different parking ratios, right? And at the Planning Commission, it turned out that the major discussion was between should it be 1 per 250 or should it be 1 per 125, right? And the pros of the 1 per 125 option was that there's less unmet parking demand that would go out onto the street, right? Because restaurants and food services generally have a pretty high parking demand ratio. So if you have a low parking ratio, like a rate, then there's potentially more unmet parking demand, so people parking their cars in the street or in neighborhoods. But if you have a 1 per 125, that's less likely to happen. But if you have 1 per 125, it makes it more difficult to switch uses around, right?
That was the discussion.
Yeah,
I didn't mean to cut
right.
you off.
And then 1 per 250 is kind of the reverse of that. It's easy to switch uses in between, but you could have more of an unmet parking demand on the street, so it could affect neighboring businesses or neighboring residences. So that was kind of the teeter-totter, right? On the one hand, you have easy to make changes, but potential parking demand issues in the neighborhood versus less demand on the neighborhood, but potentially more harder to change uses. And so the Planning Commission went back and forth a lot on that.
And
Wait,
we've been. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm going to ask the committee's indulgence because we do have some public speakers and we've got a lot of material
Okay.
to cover.
Okay.
If we can let Mr. Cato finish his presentation before we drill down into these things, I think that would be a lot better. That's all right with the committee?
Okay.
Unless you had to follow up specifically to that?
No, I think at the subcommittee level, we were thinking that the ease of changing uses was a good thing. that's where we were. It's
Yes.
been 2 years we've
No.
been at this, so,
Right.
you know,
Right.
thanks
That-
for the reminder. And maybe someone from the audience will come up and speak on that, if that was such a hot topic.
That's exactly what
Okay.
happened at the ordinance committee, and at the joint committee, and that's how the planning commission ended up at the end of their hearings.
Okay, so if we
Okay,
go ahead and get
thanks,
through the rest of the
Mr. Chair.
presentation. Thank you.
Narrowing the range of uses in the MI, currently M1 zone. The city has had on the books policies since at least the 80s to try to preserve industrial uses in the M1 zone. Enzo attempts to do that by limiting the types of uses that are allowed in the M1 zone. MI zone allows a vast range of uses, from industrial to commercial. Just about the only thing it doesn't allow is residential uses. And so the Enzo tries to reduce that, right? Not allowing standalone office, not allowing standalone retail and commercial and restaurant, in order to try to preserve that zone for industrial uses. Now, some standalone offices would be allowed for public works uses and utility land uses. That was a specific concern brought to us by Marburg, and we addressed that. And then other uses would be allowed as accessory uses. So you could possibly have a food manufacturing business with a little food retail associated with it. Those limitations are mostly size based. The next thing is Veronica Meadows, new parkland. Veronica Meadows is in the Las Positas Valley. If you look at this bird's eye view, here's Las Positas Road. The new roundabout is just about down here. And this is Ealing's Park. In red is the basic outlines of the new parkland. And it would be accessed from Allen Road, which is kind of right here. This is currently part of the Veronica Meadows specific plan, Area A, and a small adjacent parcel. In 2016, this was acquired by Parks and Rec Department, but it was previously approved for 25 dwelling units. The Enzo proposes to change the zoning, the general plan, the local coastal program, land use, and parks designation to create the new parkland. Zoning would be PR, right? Parks and Recreation. Both the general plan and LCP land use designations would be park/open space, and the park designation would be open space. Mobile food vendors, this wasn't that much discussed. I wanted to bring it up here, though, because there has been misinformation in the media, and that misinformation is that the Enzo would prohibit mobile food vending on private property, and it's the exact opposite situation. Now, the zoning ordinance only has purview on private property, so we're only talking about mobile food vending on private property. There's a separate and parallel track effort going on from the city attorney's office for mobile food vending in the public right-of-way. We did jointly meet, we had a joint meeting with the city attorney's office and mobile food vendors in something like December of 2015 to hear their concerns. So, like I said, it's the opposite of the misinformation. Right now, the current zoning ordinance does not allow mobile food vending, but the Enzo proposes to allow it with some restrictions, and I'll quickly go over what they are. They have to be in a non-residential zone with non-residential uses on the lot. You're only allowed one mobile food vendor per parking lot. Food and beverage only. There's no time of day restrictions, but you are limited to a maximum of 4 hours at a time. So, and then a total of 90 days on site, which is about twice a week. They have to be motorized, no push carts, and no standalone trailers. They have to be at least 500 feet apart from each other on private property. There is no restriction, though, if there's one on private property and there's one on the street right next to it. That's not being regulated. They may displace up to 3 required parking spaces for the 4 hours that they're allowed to be there, although no more than 10% of the parking spaces. So if you only have a 10-space parking lot, you can only displace 1 parking lot. If you have less than 10 spaces, then you can't displace any. But there's no limit if the business is closed. So if the business is closed, you can use the entire parking lot, and that would be fine. There's no minimum distance from schools. A trash receptacle is required. No music is allowed, and a business license, a zoning affidavit, and property owner approval is required. These are the things that are allowed just in the ordinary course of business, right? It's easy to get this. If mobile food vendors wanted something more, like they wanted to be there for more than 4 hours. They wanted more than one vendor, or they wanted to be closer than 500 feet, that sort of thing. They could apply for a temporary use permit to ask for additional allowances. Accessory dwelling units, and this wasn't a major topic either, but I wanted to just reiterate that in January 2017, new state rules came into effect. They nullified the city's ordinances, and we're operating right now under state law. On April 6th, at the joint meeting of the Planning Commission and the City Council, we got direction to expedite the adoption of the accessory dwelling unit ordinance. We have hired a consultant, and we're anticipating public review this summer. Now, in Attachment 7, there's a whole laundry list of items that the Planning Commission discussed. These are major topics. I'm not going to go over all those. There are a few, though, that are important. One is non-conforming parking, the 50% rule for additions. One is parking requirements for change of use from industrial to non-industrial uses. Neighborhood markets, open yard, non-conforming stuff, minor zoning exceptions, central business district expansion, and accessory buildings and garages. I'll go over those quickly. So right now, if you have non-conforming parking, that means you don't have as many parking spaces as the ordinance requires. You're allowed to alter your site. You're allowed to even do some additions, but there's limitations on the additions. The first one is that if the addition that you're proposing requires more parking spaces for the addition, you have to provide that number. But you don't have to provide for all the non-conforming that currently is there. You get to move this non-conforming credit forward. But if you do more than a 50% addition cumulatively back to July 15th, 1980, then you do have to bring your parking up to code. So let's say you had a 1,000 square foot house and you did a 200 square foot addition in 1980 and you 1982, let's say, and then you wanted to do a 300 square foot addition now, you'd have to bring your parking all the way up to code. And that's been problematic for a lot of different applicants. And after much discussion, the Planning Commission recommended to eliminate the 50% rule. So you don't have to, if adopted that way, people would not have to bring their parking up to code if they did more than a 50% addition. The next one is non-conforming parking change of use from industrial to non-industrial. Remember, we talked about the M1 zone and the desire to try to preserve industrial. This is another tool that ENZO proposes to try to help that. Right now, the way it works is if you're non-conforming to parking and you're changing a use to something that needs more parking, you have to provide for the addition, for the new uses, the new parking that's required by the change of use. But you don't have to bring your parking all the way up to code. You never have to do that. You always get to bring your non-conforming credit with you to the new use. And that makes it a little bit easier to change uses. And in order to try to preserve industrial uses, what ENZO proposes that is if you're proposing to change use from an industrial use to a non-industrial use, like commercial, restaurant, whatever, you have to bring your parking all the way up to code. So you no longer get this credit that you get to bring along. You have to, if the new use requires 50 parking spaces, you have to provide 50 parking spaces, not just the difference between what you're supposed to have and what's needed. Planning Commission recommended this as another tool in the toolbox to try to preserve industrial uses.
Chair, may I please, just because it's because we had a discussion about too many breweries and wineries going in down there. Not a bad thing, but too much, would take away from the industrial purpose.
Right.
So that addresses that. Right?
Correct. This is to address situations like that.
Thank you. See, I just needed to. Okay. Thanks.
Next is neighborhood markets. Right now, neighborhood markets are not allowed in the zoning code. So all the neighborhood markets that you see around town are existing legal nonconforming. In response to a general plan, policy, or implementation strategy, the ENZO proposes to allow them with certain restrictions. Planning Commission recommended allowing neighborhood markets in most zones with a performance standard permit, and in the single unit residential zones, the single family zones, with a conditional use permit. And the difference between those, if for those who are listening, is that a conditional use permit is heard and decided on by the Planning Commission, where performance standard permit is heard by the staff hearing officer. It's a lesser process. I mean, it's not as an intense a process, I should say. And there are some limitations. I have them up on the slide here. Limited to 1,500 square feet per lot. They have to be at least 500 feet apart. The hours would be determined by whoever decides, the PSP or the CUP. No more than 35% of the lot area devoted to food service use. Outdoor seating is allowed in the front setback only. Produce display would be allowed, but not in walkways or parking spaces and that sort of thing. No automobile parking required, but bike parking would be required. Setbacks, if you were proposing a brand new building, which is a neighborhood market, you would be subject to double setbacks. But if you're proposing to convert an existing building, you wouldn't. They must be maintained, clean and orderly. And they must comply with the outdoor lighting ordinance, and a PSP would be required in all zones except single unit zones, which require the higher level of review, the CUP. Now, there are a couple of existing non-conforming neighborhood markets that are bigger than 1,500 square feet, so they would be allowed a small allowance, 250 square feet, to increase in size. Non-conforming structures, site development and uses. The Joint Committee and the Planning Commission spent quite a bit of time on this. The city's rules actually on non-conforming buildings and such are pretty liberal in terms of what you could do, but they are confusing. When we first adopted them back in 1996 or so, that was the first attempt, and in 20 years of administering it, we've learned a lot of lessons that we tried to move forward into a better way of regulating non-conforming uses. So the Planning Commission recommended amendments that clarifies a lot of our issues and would allow most alterations if they're at least 5 feet away from the property line. And we see a lot of modifications for these types of minor things right now. So we hope that this reduces the number of modification requests that we see. Some examples of this are windows and door alterations in the front setback. Right now, those need modifications, but that would be allowed by right. Windows and door alterations in the interior setback would be allowed by right if they're at least 5 feet away from the property line and on the ground floor. Additions to non-conforming portions of buildings, right, buildings that encroach into setbacks, would be allowed along the same plane, but a maximum of 20 linear feet. So it's a limited amount of addition you can do in your setback. Up to 250 square feet of an addition would be allowed if you're non-conforming to density, which means you have more residential units on site than are allowed. And this you couldn't put in new bedrooms, but you could do new common space like a laundry room or a common area or a gym or storage space, that kind of thing. And then lastly of my examples here, if you have an undersized garage, like a lot of places in town have a little garage butted up against the rear and the side property line, like way in the back corner, and it doesn't meet today's standards. Right now, if you want to expand it to meet the standards, you need a modification. What ENZO proposes is to allow that to be expanded to the minimum size for a one-car garage or two-car garage, whatever you have, without a modification. So if you have an undersized one-car garage, you can bring it up to the size of the minimum one-car garage, and you can even demo and rebuild it at the new size without a modification. But you couldn't go to a two-car garage. Similarly, if you have an undersized two-car garage, you could go to a regulation-sized two-car garage without a modification. So it's a lot of different things like that. These are just some examples of a lot of different standards. And the next thing are minor zoning exceptions. There is a minor zoning exception that the council recently approved. It's for overheight fences and hedges. And that is under the purview of the community development director right now. There are other, and that is primarily a neighborhood compatibility and an aesthetic issue. There are other things, zoning issues, that are also primarily neighborhood compatibility and aesthetics, like the ones that are listed. Increases in building height in the setback up to 42 inches, window and door alterations and interior setbacks if closer than 5 feet to the property line on the ground floor or on an upper story, decks in the setbacks up to 18 inches high, and waste and recycling enclosures and setbacks. Those are all proposed because they are primarily neighborhood compatibility and aesthetic. Enzor proposes to transfer the responsibility, actually to create the new responsibility in the design boards and transfer responsibility of the fence and hedge to the design boards as well. Required open yard is another significant change, I would say. Right now, open yard requirements are based on zone and not by use type. So if you have a single family, like a house in a single family zone, you have a certain open yard requirement. If that same house is in the R3 zone, it's a different and lesser standard. So what Enzor proposes is to require open yard by the type of use you have, right? All single unit residential would have the same open yard requirement regardless of what zone you're in. Same for 2-unit residential and mixed and multi-unit. A big change to multi-unit residential. Right now, there's 2 methods of having open yard. One is called private outdoor living space, and one's called common outdoor living space. Enzor proposes to kind of take the best of both worlds because it's kind of confusing. There's so many requirements that are sort of similar but not quite, so people get confused. Enzor proposes to take the best of both worlds and create a new single standard called private open yard. And because of various discussions we had with the Planning Commission going forward, we added back in an alternative open yard, which is basically the same as the common open yard standard today. But in order to get that, a design board would have to make a finding that it's needed for flexibility or design, or for a better design on the project. Now, for AUD projects, there are some incentives. AUD, average unit density. There are incentives if you're in non-residential zones. There are open yard incentives. And so to preserve those incentives in non-residential zones, the Enzor proposes equivalent standards. So there's really no change for AUD projects in commercial zones as far as open yard goes. In response to circulation element implementation policy, the Enzor proposes to expand the boundaries of the central business district. You can see on this map the existing boundary is in this dashed line here, and it comes straight down on the west side and comes back across. It actually comes across like this. What Enzor proposes is the dotted line. So go out to the boundary of the C2 zone on most of the west side, but not all the way out to the freeway, and then squaring off the RO zone in the northwest or the north corner, and then adding a few blocks down in the CM to make this line go straight down. And the Planning Commission recommended that expansion. Accessory buildings and garages, right now, every property is allowed a 500 square foot maximum accessory building and either a 500 or 750 square foot garage, depending on the zone or the lot size. And they can't be used, they can be in the same building, but they can't be used for the same purpose. For example, you can't have a 500 square foot garage and a 500 square foot other garage, which is your accessory building, because that would be a 1,000 square foot garage, which is more than that's allowed. In response to some public comment early on and some staff discussion, we presented an idea that you could have more accessory space or garage with bigger lots as one thing, and the second is you could combine them. You could use them together. So you could have a 400 square foot. You could have a 1,000 square foot garage if you wanted one. This table attempts to show it in a clear way. These rows here are the lot size, right? Less than 20,000, 20,000 to 1 acre, an acre to 3 acres, and over 3 acres. And these crossed out numbers show what you're allowed right now. So you're allowed a 500 square foot garage, and then if once you're beyond 20,000 square feet, you can have 750. You can have a 500 square foot accessory building no matter what size. What is proposed is to allow these numbers to get bigger. So ignore this column for a second. Total garage size would be the same if you're 20,000, same up to an acre. But once you go 1 to 3 acres, you could have 1,500 square feet, so an additional 250 square feet. And then once you go 3 acres or more, you can have another 250 for 1,750, with a maximum of 500 square feet of detachable living area, detached livable floor area. And then this would be the maximum size you can have in any single building, which is the same as it is today. We are asking the Ordinance Committee for direction on one item, and that item is, when would ENZO affect projects that are in the pipeline? We anticipate that the ENZO would become effective probably 60 to 90 days after adoption. And on or after that adoption effective date, all new projects have to comply with the ENZO. And we think that's great. And we think that most people will want to comply with the new regulations because in a lot of ways it's easier as far as process and what we allow. However, there are a bunch of projects that are in the pipeline right now, and they spent time and money getting to wherever point they are in the process, and they may want to continue using the old ordinance, the current ordinance. And at what point should that cutoff be to allow them to keep moving forward? The Planning Commission recommended that if you have a project approval, either a project design approval by the design boards or some other discretionary approval by either the staff hearing officer or the Planning Commission, or if you had a building permit issued, then you could keep using the old ordinance. But as you can see, that was a 4-3 vote. And the Planning Commissioners all expressed some concern for the pending projects in that they have spent a lot of time and money getting to the point where they are in the process. And the 3 that voted against that motion felt like there should be a point in the process earlier in the process for those people who haven't been approved yet, but they have gone a long ways, right? We've listed out 5 possible time points that could be used to determine who gets to keep moving forward with with the current ordinance. The 2 in green are the ones that the Planning Commission have already recommended, right? If you have a building permit issued, or if you have some sort of discretionary approval, you could keep using the ordinance. If the Ordinance Committee is interested in exploring this idea some more, then we would suggest that application completeness be another point that we could talk about to allow people who've gotten applications complete to use the current ordinance. And there are a couple of other options, and if the Ordinance Committee is interested, we can talk about those. Environmental review. The document is an addendum to the certified final EIR for Plan Santa Barbara, and all changes are covered and consistent with those policies and with that analysis. Now it's the time for me to make a recommendation to you. We, staff, recommend that the Ordinance Committee recommend the adoption of the new zoning ordinance and all related municipal code, general plan, and local coastal program amendments to the City Council as listed on the Ordinance Committee agenda report. The next steps are Council. If it all goes like I expect it to go today, then we're scheduled for July 11th at the Council. And post-adoption, we'll prepare a package to submit to the Coastal Commission so that ENZO would become operative in the coastal zone and start that process. And starts a little longer than I thought, but that concludes my staff presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Cato. Let's go ahead before we get into committee questions and let the public speakers speak. And we also have a couple of committee and commission members here that we may want to hear from before we ask our questions. So I'm going to ask Kurt Huffman to come forward, please. You have 2 minutes.
Hi, Kurt Huffman. Won't take that long. Just wanted to say thanks to Danny. And this goes a long ways back. I just want to say, yes, I concur with the ENZO. Like to see it move forward as is. and appreciate everybody's hard work. Thanks.
Thank you. Then I have Commissioner Higgins.
Councilmember Rouse, thank you. I'm here to answer questions or try to represent what the Planning Commission was thinking on some of these items. Can talk to you about how we were split up on some of the more interesting topics. I don't have a presentation for you today. I apologize for the attire and maybe lack of something prepared, but wanted to be here to just address any questions you might have. So in particular, parking, we had a split on the timing of when these things would become applicable. There was a split and a good discussion. Keep in mind, we had 3 hearings. This is after all the workshops, and it's the nuance of the nuance, right, that you're getting into. And frankly, my personal opinion is on these is that I weighed a lot of the recommendations against what staff has gone through over the last however many years at trying to band-aid the code and the solutions and the interpretations together, noting that the preamble in your report here and the objectives of this effort are pretty well structured in terms of making it easier to use, addressing non-conforming situations, allowing for adaptive reuse, implementing the general plan. So our decisions really filtered against all of those as best we could. And we were mostly unified in our decisions, with some exceptions, of course, and I can get into those if you want to just go ahead and start launching at me, or after public comment, I can stay for another
Rather open
hour
question,
or so.
what were you thinking when? Do we have questions from the committee? Ms. Murillo.
I have questions for staff. Thank you, Mr. Higgins, or Chair Higgins. Thank you.
Okay, and then, okay, we're good with that? That's it? No more speaker slips? All right, very good. It's back to the committee. Ms. Murillo.
Mr. Cato, can you go back to slide 65? And just take that a little slower, because I'm remembering that the joint committee. Yes, sir. So the joint committee, I think, did not agree with the Planning Commission, right? We liked the other way. We had a long discussion about this.
Yes. So the way.
So this is apartment houses and condominiums.
Correct.
Right? Okay.
And this was an evolution, kind of an evolutionary process, and what the staff had originally proposed was put by the wayside because of comments that we got from the joint committee, and then we proposed an earlier iteration of what you see before you, right? Okay, I'm going to tell you the whole history. Sorry. What we proposed originally, when we looked at multi-unit residential, we looked at the private outdoor living space and we looked at the common outdoor living space methods, and we found that it was like inherently unfair. If you use the private outdoor living space option, then the more units you have, the more open space you have to have, right? Because each unit has its own private little patio or balcony. So the more units you have, the more outdoor space you have. Whereas you have the common open space method, you're only required 15% of your lot area plus 120 by 20 area. So if you have 4 units on the lot, you need 120 by 20 area. If you have 1,000 units on the lot, you need 120 by 20 area, and that's it. We didn't think that was fair, right? So our first iteration was to say we want to make these two things equal. So if you're going to choose common outdoor, then we proposed that you had to provide more common outdoor living space for each unit that got bigger and bigger, right? And when we went to the joint committee, I remember I think it was more than one person said that that would be detrimental to the construction of housing, because so much of the lot area would have to be devoted to open yard. There'd be less and less building area available to actually have units. So based on that, we went back as staff and re-looked at why do we even have these two different methods? It's very confusing to people. Why don't we just have one way of doing it? So we had a bunch of discussions among staff, and then we presented to the Planning Commission a single method, right? And it's the private open yard. And like I said, it took the best of both worlds and combined it into a single way of providing open yard, and it was a slightly less overall potentially, but more usable space. And when we went to the Planning Commission, I think we talked to them both in Module 2 and Module 3 about open yard. And the commissioners, at least some of them, were concerned about the AUD experiment and how changes to these open yard requirements might change the AUD experiment. So we took, but the Planning Commission mostly liked it for generally, right? So we took those comments back, and then we decided we would come back with the alternative open yard methodology, and to allow AUD projects to use either one, So it's sort of like back to where we were for AUD projects a little bit, but it was all in response to Planning Commission direction to us.
Okay, so you're saying they could do either of those two things?
Well, the main difference for, unless you're in a commercial zone, AUD in a commercial zone, the main difference is you can propose the alternative, right, which is the same as common outdoor living space, but in order to get that approved, you have to present that to the design board or maybe the Planning Commission and describe how that alternative method is necessary in order to have a better design or to have different flexibility to meet project objectives. So, and the way I like to think of it, although it doesn't quite say this, is it sort of you have to look at it and think it's sort of equivalent to what you would get using the private open yard method. So you have to. So it's not just as an applicant, I don't get to choose which one I use like it is now. I have to, if I want to use alternative, I have to ask for approval. That's the main difference. Unless you're an AUD project in a commercial zone, then you get to choose still, because that's the incentive you have now. Sorry, it's very confusing. We tried to make it simple, but we kept getting different direction.
Thank you. My second question is about the neighborhood markets, because we've had some correspondence. But if I'm remembering correctly, we were hoping that neighborhood markets, which work really well on my West Side district, we don't have to get in our car and go somewhere if we're short on, tomato sauce for our rice or milk or something for coffee in the morning, so that a single family area would have that same kind of, in the newer areas, right? The neighborhood markets are generally downtown and east side, west side, right?
Right.
And so in the newer areas,
Yes.
if that's the way to say it, it would be a convenience to have a market where you could
Correct.
just walk somewhere and get stuff while you walk your dog. So I that was our thinking. If you could just expound on that for the people that are concerned that it'll change the nature of a single family neighborhood.
So, yes, you're exactly right about those discussions, and the requirements are largely unchanged from the joint committee days. We did receive a letter, and that letter expressed some concern about allowing neighborhood markets in single family residential zones. The writers of the letter thought it was a degradation of the single family zoning designation, right, to allow basically food. I mean, up to 35% of a neighborhood market could be for food prep and restaurant sort of, to sandwich shop, that kind of thing. So that could be seen as a degradation. But it really, and part of the discussion that happened at the Planning Commission was that, our single family zones really, do they have enough density of people to support a neighborhood market? Right, and so the commission was split on whether to allow them with a CUP in the single family zones or not, and Enzo, it continues in Enzo because the CUP process is a very robust public process whereby there's notification of neighbors, there's staff analysis, There are 7 members of the Planning Commission weighing the factors of, are there enough people? Is it going to degrade the neighborhood? That kind of discussion would happen on a case by case basis. We see an intersection sometimes. Maybe it wouldn't be appropriate completely in the middle of a single family zone, but there could be the outskirts, right? There could be the interface between a multifamily zone and a single family zone, and it just happens to work better on the single family side of the street than it does on the multifamily side, right? It is an option to not allow them in single family zones, period. We as staff felt like the conditional use permit process was robust enough that it could handle the discussion on a case by case basis.
Okay, so someone would propose that, and they would have to go to the Planning Commission, and they would have to do like design review as well.
Design review would depend more on if they were proposing any exterior changes, but any exterior changes would require design review. So outdoor seating, that kind of thing, that would all happen with design review.
I think there's enough protections there in terms of the approval process. And certainly if people opposed the project, they would come out, right, and speak their minds. So in terms of the mobile vending, I'm not liking the 90-day limit. A lot of these are small businesses, and I think they would like to be operating a lot longer than 90 days. So however I can pull that out or argue to my colleagues that, we should look at a different number. Mr. Cato, didn't you hear that at the meeting that we had at the Cabrillo Pavilion, right? That's where we had the mobile vending people come out. And
yes, Councilmember Kerr, yes, we did hear that. But when we did kind of a web research on the mobile food vendors that we knew about, it seemed like they would go to the same spot about once a week, maybe twice a week. So that's where the 90 days came from, because that's not quite twice a week. But it's really that's where we got with the Planning Commission and the Joint Committee. If the Ordinance Committee wants to make a recommendation to Council to make that more, then yeah, please have that discussion.
I'm persuaded because it's private property. Mm-hmm. And if the owner of the property wants to do that, then they could allow more than just a 90-day time period. Okay, so maybe we'll hear more from the audience, I'm not sure. And then on your specific question, yes. I'm leaning towards application completeness. It's not fair if we put the rules out there and someone puts in an application and then we change it. So we could pick a date, like you say, into the future, and everybody knows, okay, after this date, it's the new ENZO, and they have to adhere to that. So that seemed like a compromise somewhat. Not application submittal, that's a lesser standard, right? So application completeness is what your staff is favoring?
Yes, there's definitely some options other than application completeness. Application completeness is kind of, more robust because in order to be complete, there has to be a certain amount of staff interaction and staff review to be deemed complete, right? So that it's a, serious application. Okay. For application submittal, it could be just anything. And so of the other types that we do favor application completeness, we've had some discussions with the city attorney's office about potential other options. One being if you've had 2 concept reviews, by the design boards or at planning commission or combination, that might be a way to show that it's a serious application as opposed to just somebody submitting something. So there are a few other options, but we do favor application completeness.
Okay. And Mr. Chair, Planning Commission Chair Higgins, I think, had a position on this, if I'm reading the material correctly. May I ask for his opinion? Thank you.
Councilmember Rouse and to Councilmember Murillo. if you ever talk to anybody that's gone through the process, architects or applicants or homeowners, and you have an awareness of the money and time they spend to get in, let alone get deemed complete, it's quite an investment that we felt was enough of a burden, or at least personally I felt was enough of a burden, but I was in the majority on that split. And I think the discussion that the Planning Commission centered around those projects that were AUD oriented that don't really have a clean milestone for completeness determination. In our mind, those are projects that are design review only to some degree, and that's a little awkward. So I think that's where the other commissioners were thinking, because we're really talking mostly about the bigger ticket projects in the pipeline now that are the elephant in the room, that those ought to be, the cleaner milestone there was an approval. Is that about what you remember the discussion being?
That seemed to be the majority opinion as I remember it.
And maybe there's a way to break off AUD from everybody else that is in and out of the building department, which there are quite a few other customers of the 630 Garden Street, not AUD related, that would have a cleaner break on just application completeness. So that's the thinking there.
Thank you. The AUD-focused housing task force is closing in on that question for your information and for the information of the public listening. I think that's it from me right now, Mr. Chair. Thank you,
Mr.
Mr.
Hotchkiss?
Higgins.
So I understand approval is where you came down? Just
That
questionary
was the
approval?
vote, if I recall, 4-3. So yeah.
It's okay. I think that's all I got for you. Thank you. Regarding neighborhood markets, wherever they may be, do they not represent, if they're in a residential zone, an increased traffic burden and other usages? You got cars necessarily coming and going, right?
Well, that's the fear, right? That's the concern that was expressed in the letter, is that these could become magnets of people driving from other neighborhoods, and they wouldn't just be for people walking. I mean, and I suppose that could happen, but generally, what we found in the city right now with the neighborhood markets that exist is that that isn't what's happening, right? People don't go from Santa Roque to the east side because there's this great neighborhood market there. It just doesn't work that way, right? They are really for and frequented by the generalized neighbors. So although, I mean, it's not inconceivable, we just found it highly unlikely, and I think the Planning Commission did as well.
Well, and just anecdotally, the one that comes to mind to me is the one on Mitchell, Torina, and where is it, Olive or something?
Yeah, between Olive and Laguna.
Right. So, and I do see increased at least cars stopping there.
Right.
And they've got, I think, a green.
Right.
So, I mean, that's a convenience. And I'm sure, I guess people also walk there, but you've got multifamily residential units nearby.
Correct.
So I don't know how much of an effect that has.
Well, I mean, I think it's our opinion that density of people is important for a neighborhood market, right? And that's why we're not even sure as staff whether anyone would ever come in and propose a neighborhood market in a single family zone, but why not have that allowance with the CUP so that in case there is some situation where a person thinks it's going to work and the Planning Commission thinks it'll work, then why not give them the opportunity instead of just closing the door completely? That's why the CUP is still in there. And again, it's up to if the ordinance committee has a recommendation about something different or the council decides something different. That's just how we got to where we are now.
Could neighborhood approval be a part of that process? I mean, if I buy a house in, any house in Santa Barbara, let's say we're in the bungalow district, it's $1 million or more, $1.5 million. I don't think I want a business right in the same block, discretionary. Just somebody come along and decide, I would like some protections.
Well, the beauty of the conditional use permit process is that you have those protections, right? You have neighborhood notice. you have a staff analysis, you have the opportunity to come to the planning commission and make your concerns known, and gather your neighbors to do that, and then if it gets approved, despite your protestations, you can appeal it to the planning, you can appeal to the council. So I think, at least we as staff feel that there are built-in protections in the CUP process to handle neighborhood concerns.
Well, I hear those more as you say, neighborhood concerns, but not protections. And I honestly, if I lived in that area, or San Roque or San Joaquin, I'd want out protection. So
Well,
I guess we're in a different position.
Please, it's up to the ordinance committee. If you have if you want to recommend something different on neighborhood markets, please have a discussion and make a recommendation to council.
No, and Ms. Maria makes good points also, but to me it's a little bit of a line in the sand. When we were talking about removing the need for modifications on a number of different things, just for both me and the public, explain why that would be important.
So
I mean, does it cost more to have a
well,
modification?
okay. Let me give a little bit of background for those people out in TV land who don't know about modifications.
Please.
No, the zoning ordinance has requirements, right? Minimum distances between buildings and property lines that we call setbacks, and height limitations and all that kind of stuff, right? There's a whole bunch of rules and regulations, and there's thousands of different individual property configurations in the city, and the way houses have built based on old zoning rules and what have you, and so there are many thousands of houses and buildings that don't comply with today's codes, and those people who own those properties want to make some additions or changes, and they can't because they don't meet the rules. Now, the modification process is a process whereby people can ask for special permission, right? We have this situation, we want to do this addition, we can't do it because it's in a setback or whatever, our open yard's too small, that kind of thing. And so the modification allows people to come forward through a public process where neighbors are noticed about, we want to do this project. There's a decision maker, there are findings that have to be made. And so that's a process that's been in place for, I'm not even sure how long, since the 70s or earlier. And but that's a process that's expensive and time consuming. So, and it can take from the first time someone comes and talks to us at the counter to the time they get a modification can be, I don't know, 4, 6 or more months, right? Depending on the timing of various things. So that's, time is money. People want to do their projects. They have to wait a long time. You have to hire usually an architect or some sort of designer to present something for you, draw all this stuff up for you. It's expensive. There are fees involved, and not having to go through the modification process makes it that much faster, that much less expensive to try to do some sort of development in your property. And so for those types of development that we as staff and the Enzo Joint Committee and Planning Commission felt were innocuous enough, they're either allowed by right, or some of them are allowed with this thing called the minor zoning exception, which would be granted by the design boards.
So there's some discretion there. You can't just do anything.
Correct.
The staff's going to look at it and say, this is a minor deal.
Yeah, some of these things you are just allowed to do up to the limits, right? If you have a wall on your house that's 5 feet away from the property line and you want to put in new windows and doors on the first floor, you can just put them wherever you want, right? That's just allowed by right. But if you're 4 feet away on the ground floor, then you have to get the minor zoning exception, and the design boards have to make a finding that, that it's that is okay. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. You said that the Planning Commission, I guess, suggested extending the downtown business area to a minor degree.
Well, Not exactly. The Planning Commission recommended it, but that topic came to the fore because it's a circulation element policy to look at expanding the CBD, the Central Business District downtown. So because it's a general plan implementation action to be considered, then we considered it as staff. We put it forward to the Joint Committee and the Planning Commission, and both of those bodies felt that it was a good thing to do to expand it.
Right. Okay. So it just doesn't seem that big a deal to me. I mean,
I don't think it is that big a deal. But it is something that would change things. It could change it could change people's experience going through the development process, because parking in those expanded areas would be less of a problem, right? Less of an issue.
regarding the mobile food vendors, are we thinking mostly of people at construction sites, or are we talking people on what?
No.
Where are these now?
So
I mean, I know there's some on San Andres in
Yes.
parking lots and stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
So the old roach coach, that paradigm is not what we're talking about, right? That's when the truck comes to the construction site and you sell like sandwiches and drinks like that. I mean, those still exist and those would continue to exist, but we're talking about the gourmet food truck, right? This is a new phenomenon that's become the rage in the last probably 5 to 10 years, and it hasn't hit Santa Barbara as much as it's hit other places, like Los Angeles and other places where there can be vast gatherings of food trucks, food truck festivals and stuff like that. We've seen it some, but we're talking about the gourmet food that's just now in a truck instead of at a standalone, a bricks and mortar sort of restaurant.
Mr. Chair, I just want to add a little bit to that. So where we see these primarily being operated are on sites that don't serve food. So they augment some other business like a winery, brewery, or some other aspect. So then there's food provided on site. And I think it's fair, we need to represent the other side as well, that we have heard concerns from restaurant owners that, they have a brick and mortar restaurant, they have other regulations they need to comply with, and so mobile food vendors, which is why we do recommend some parameters for their operation, that there are some controls that this other business doesn't suddenly also turn into a restaurant. So that's the reason for wanting to have some limitations on how many days they can operate on a site,
Right.
and hours of operation and that sort of thing.
Locally, where are we seeing these? Because honestly, I haven't seen any.
So the ones that I know of, like the Burger Bus was one, and it used to park.
The brewery down in the Funk Zone?
Yeah, they're down in the Funk Zone. There can be over on like Quarantina. There are a couple of wine and beer places over there.
Yeah, in the Funk Zone, I see a guy just parked there all the time.
Yeah,
Period. He doesn't move.
That's the retail person, right? Yeah, and then there was one that was parking in the Home Improvement Center parking lot for a while. I don't know if they still go there. And then others more, and those are the ones that I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay, so we want to exercise some limitations, I think is what we're talking about.
Yeah, and the reason is because it's a brand new thing for the city right now. The city, we don't allow them at all. So instead of like opening the door wide open in the first, let's open it with a few restrictions on it, and then if it all goes well, then we can look at it again to see if that should be expanded.
Would they have a business license?
Yes.
Okay. On Veronica Springs, we're converting where I think it was 25 residential permits or houses permitted, right?
Well, what happened was there was, for
remember we
many
voted on
years,
this
right?
one.
Yeah, and there was a city vote because in order to access those 25 units, they had to construct a bridge over a creek,
Right.
and that impacted some parkland. There was a vote of the people voted it down,
Right.
so there's no way to access it. And I don't know the details about what happened after that, but somehow the Land Trust or another nonprofit organization in conjunction with the city acquired that land, and now it's proposed to be open space parkland.
So, Mr. Vincent.
Yes.
Would that do we have any danger of a taking accusation here?
Councilmember Rouse and members of the committee, no, there's no danger of a taking issue there. The city acquired that property and now owns it. So if there was ever a taking, I mean, we acquired it in a bargain for transaction, and the property owner was paid for, and it was a voluntary transaction.
Right, I remember
at
that.
this
Thank
point,
you.
but the key point for the committee to understand is that acquisition came along with, and the money that allowed the city to enabled the city to acquire the property had stipulations that limit the property's uses to essentially open space. The proposals are to give effect to those limitations and to formalize that as far as the zoning for the property is concerned, and that's what's being proposed.
Okay, good, thank you. Regarding the M1, we have a letter from Suzanne Elledge and her client regarding what their suggested use. I don't know if you've seen it. That would hope that I think they're asking to be grandfathered in. In fact, if we put these new regulations in place, is that possible?
Yes, it is. I found out this morning that project has been deemed complete. So if the ordinance committee were to recommend and the council were to adopt how do I say this? Were to adopt regulations that say so, then if application completeness is the cutoff point, then they're beyond the cutoff and they'd be okay.
They'd be okay. Okay.
Yeah. Now, just to be completely clear about that, that's for the project that is in right now. If somehow that project were to expire and the property owners wanted to reapply with something similar, they would no longer be able to. Except, okay, sorry, another nuance. That property is in the coastal zone, right? Because it's on the south side of Highway 101.
Right.
And like I said before, ENZO will not go into effect in the coastal zone until such time as an LCP, a local coastal program amendment, is processed. And that can take, a year, 2 plus, right? So
they're not in danger.
So right now they're not in danger. At some point in the future they could, when it comes closer to an LCP amendment being approved, that could be an issue for them.
Have you seen these letters?
Yes.
Okay, are you going to address them, talk to them?
Yeah, I've had email conversations with Trish Allen, who was here. She had to leave, so she couldn't make her public comment.
Okay.
Yes, we have been in contact, but
I mean, they seem to be making good points, so I'd like to try to help them.
yeah. Well, there are other ways to do this if the committee or the council were inclined. I mean, we could amend the specific plan to allow retail or commercial use in that area. I'm not sure that we haven't had a chance to, so as staff, we haven't had a chance to discuss how we might help these people out, right? Other than saying, here's how you're helped right now. We haven't thought about a number of different options, but there are potentially some options that could help them in addition to what I've talked about.
Well, what you
already.
said might be an option enough. We don't know. You just talk to them about it.
Right,
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
if I could jump in here a little bit. I've read the letter from Suzanne Elledge's office, and the Wright family is asking for something a little bit more than just allow them to continue with their project. They are wanting the zoning to reflect the uses that are currently allowed under the M1 zoning.
Right.
That's the underlying zoning for their specific plan. They're within a specific plan that has M1 SD3 underlying zoning for this particular project site. Yes, they could continue on with the deemed complete proposal. However, that would result ultimately in a use that would be a legal non-conforming use, and that brings up all of the challenges of having to make, if they wanted to make future changes to their use or to the structure itself, they would have legal non-conforming issues. They're asking this committee and ultimately the council to consider a different form of zoning amendment, because that's what's being proposed for the M1, reducing the number of uses in order to protect the industrial uses. They're wanting some kind of consideration in that rezoning of M1 that would allow this site to be developed with a general retail use as they have proposed in their application. And so for the committee what I would recommend the committee to consider is you have a few options. Keep it exactly the way it is. Their application has been deemed complete. You could direct staff to address the issue of projects within the process. You have a planning commission recommendation that projects within the process, only those projects that have been approved would have the ability to continue through. If you wanted to keep this with the as approved or as deemed complete, you could address it that way, but that would have this the potential non-conforming issue. You could direct staff to do something different with respect to their M1 zone amendment. And so that's where Danny was saying there may be other ways for staff to address this, and they haven't considered all of the options for how they addressed it. I would characterize it a little differently in the sense that it's not so much about a matter of how to help this developer or help this property owner. It's about a matter of how does the city want this process to move forward, and to move forward in a way, as you've all recalled during our discussion here, one of the goals of the ENZO process is to reduce the number of nonconformancies. Here's one where an applicant is pointing out a potential nonconformity being created, and so we'll take our direction from you on how to fix that problem.
This might be a good time. Ms. Allen was going to speak earlier anyway. To get your breath, Trish, and then, why don't you come on up if you would, please? Because we're out talking about you right now. And maybe we can direct some of these questions and fold it into the conversation. So if you'd like to go ahead and say what you're going to say, then I think the committee has some questions for you.
Thank you. I'm a little bit out of breath, but thank you. Trish Allen with Suzanne Elledge, Planning and Permitting. And thank you for taking my comment a little bit late. I had a historic landmark site visit scheduled for noon this afternoon, so juggling a few things. So in terms of the letter that was submitted yesterday on behalf of the Wright family, we did want to reissue our comments that were made early on in the ENZO process as it relates to proposed use limitations in the M1 zone, and asked for consideration of this particular property within the Cabrillo Plaza specific plan. We have been in process with a proposed retail commercial development on that site consistent with today's M1 zone and the specific plan that was adopted some time ago. In fact, that was the site visit that I just went to. We have a hearing for that project this afternoon at Historic Landmarks Commission, and staff is in the process of completing an initial study, an EIR scoping document to analyze the possible environmental impacts for that project. So we are moving forward on it. Some of the timing was a little bit slowed down to carry out some geotechnical analysis, slowed us down almost by a whole year. I'm not sure about what was talked about from Mr. Vincent before I walked in, but that's sort of the context. So if the ENZO timing were to be such that to allow folks to proceed under the current zoning ordinance and allowed uses and application completeness were the timing, then this project could proceed and still be consistent with the zoning ordinance that's in place now. So that would be one way to take care of it. I further suggested to staff that perhaps this property, because of the surrounding uses, be considered differently than other M1 properties. And I put that information, and the family did put the information in the letter for your consideration. I had a couple other comments, and I can go through those very quickly, or do you have questions about that? We can do that, or
unless the committee has specific questions about Ms. Allen.
No, I'd like to hear. Go ahead, keep going, please.
Okay.
On the other topics, separate of the Wright property, that was all I was going to say about.
All right, no, let's stick with that then. So, Mr. Vincent pointed out that whereas you might make it past the gate right now for your completeness, down the line, if there was a proposed change, you'd have to come under the new rules. Is that satisfactory under the new ENZO?
Oh, thank you for that clarification, because I wasn't.
Correctly?
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Committee Member Hotchkiss, the point I was making is that, yes, one particular path, and Ms. Allen just mentioned that if they continued on with the M1 changes as proposed by staff with the ENZO, that if application completeness was the point in time where applicants could continue under the current rules, the use could go through. It's an allowed use under the current zoning, and they would be effectively grandfathered. It would be a legal non-conforming use
For now.
I guess as I sit here now, once you have a general retail use there, I wouldn't expect that use to change for quite some time. It would be the proposal right now is for a large structure. General retail can cover a number of different retail avenues. It's not tied into one particular type of retailer. So that non-conforming use could be a way for the property owner to carry forward. I read their letter as to they were looking for something a bit more, and were hoping to avoid having to go forward with a non-conforming use. I believe their first desire would be to have this process of the ENZO process and whatever changes to M1 accommodate their proposal, whether that's somehow built into the revisions to the M1 zone, or if there was actually a separate zoning action to put them into a different zone that would again accommodate their proposed general retail use.
Reply?
Thank you. I agree with Mr. Vincent. Ideally, and the way the letter is written, this came up. My second comment came up later. Came to my in my mind later. So ideally, we are asking that this property be treated differently in terms of the M1 zone. What that means mechanically within the ENZO, I don't have a suggestion for that.
To be determined.
It could. And I could work on some draft language following this hearing to suggest something to staff to say to accept, pull out the Cabrillo Plaza specific plan from these M1 changes. That might be one way of doing it. I would be concerned about the future for this property and the ability to have tenant changes if the uses are non-conforming. We have retail. We do have a commercial market proposed. We also have a restaurant proposed. We want to have, flexibility with changing those tenant uses out. So that's my response.
I don't think we're going to totally get into the weeds on that one.
Right, Ms. Murillo has a question, and we also need to be careful not to get into a hearing on this project, so, specifically.
One of the main themes that we've had in this process is to protect the M1 industrial uses. And so to give you the ability to go forward with the project under application completeness is significant. So you're going to go ahead and do something that's not industrial. And so being non-conforming might just be part of that accommodation, which I think is significant. So I would prefer to see industrial uses there myself. That it's dwindling. When you talk to the construction yards, they say a lot of their supplies and other businesses that had supported that kind of industrial use and the construction and building activities has gone to Oxnard and other places because there's too much housing on the rim, too many breweries and wineries closing in. So I understand this project, and it looks like you might be able to go through with it depending on the process. Mm-hmm. But that's my position, Mr. Chair, is that there's a lot of legal non-conforming in this town, and I think it's fine for you to ask for that. But to understand that it should be a bigger discussion at the City Council. And when's that might be 2 months from now, or are we going to turn this around in a month's time? So maybe there'll be more information coming out of your project application at that time. Thank you. When do you think it might go to the city council, Mr. Cato or Ms. Brooke?
Do you mean the Enzo?
Yeah, right.
Or July 11th is what we're
Oh, it's all
planning
set,
on.
July
Well,
11th.
Well,
From
that's
here.
the plan anyway, yes.
Okay, thank you. So a lot might happen between now and July 11th.
I
Thank you.
understand.
But once again, all this is going to be pending our LCP going forward.
Yeah, that's correct. This property would not be affected until the local coastal program amendment is adopted. And that
don't
is
know when.
a while, a long ways away, in my opinion.
Great. All right. Thank you, Ms. Allen.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Mr. Vincent.
Let her finish and I'll
I just wasn't sure if I was allowed to make the other public comment that I had intended to, but if I missed my opportunity, I understand I've
Well, you
submitted a
kind of
letter.
got to what I really don't want to get into weeds on your particular project. At this point in time, we have to keep it in with the NZO and what we're doing there. So, I want to keep that in context. Did you have
I
something?
just had some general comments about the Enzo, not related to the right property. But if that ship has sailed, I'll go sit down.
I'm done with my questions. I'm not sure if Mr. Hotchkiss was done with his questions. You have questions?
I do have questions, but if you want to, if it's
So public
is
comment is
specifically
is
about the
later.
NZO, then and why don't you take 2 more minutes and we'll go with that. How's that?
Okay, thank you. So in addition to those comments, I did want to come today and just express from our office perspective, our universal appreciation for the changes that are proposed in the new zoning ordinance. We really appreciate the reformatting. We find it much superior and more user-friendly, as Mr. Kato was explaining during his presentation, to be able to fully exhaust all the development standards that would relate to a particular question that we're researching. We have been participating all along and making comments. I did want to reiterate comments that we came and made at the Planning Commission while the Commission was considering all the subcommittee comments, in particular with the food service issue, and reiterate our support and our positive input for supporting the Planning Commission recommendation of the 1 parking space per 250 square feet of floor area for food service properties that are outside the central business district. I did leave a letter for you. I'm sorry it was late, reiterating some other ideas about parking, funk zone, things that can happen in that area that we want to just keep putting forth. And I believe that was all I wanted to,
Okay,
to
thank
say.
you very
Thank
much.
you for reopening public comment.
Very good. Okay, I had a few questions of my own for staff. And so clearly everything, as we said before, everything south of the freeway is going to be pending, or we'll have our thing in place and it'll be pending the approval of the or the LCP in terms of implementation of the NZO. Is that I'm still a little confused about that, but
I'm sorry, I wasn't listening.
in terms of the NZO portion that's in the coastal zone,
Yes.
that we can set what we're going to set, but it really doesn't become official until we get the local coastal plan
Yes,
approved.
Chair Rouse, that's true, but whatever the council approves for Enzo and all the associated changes, that's sort of this thing that's set in stone, which we will then give to the Coastal Commission to ask for their, for the LCP amendment. So it's not like there's, unless something weird happens, there's not really an opportunity to make changes to the LCP amendment. So anything that, for example, for Ms. Allen's project, the Wright property, if the ordinance committee were interested in recommending a change to what is proposed in Enzo right now, that should happen today. So the recommendation gets made to council, council makes a decision, and then whatever that decision is gets packaged up and sent to the Coastal Commission.
Okay. Then conversely, then with the ADU in terms of single family zones,
Yes.
that is also an upcoming hearing pending on how we want to, because the ADU is going to supersede our neighborhood single-family zoning issues in terms of the accessory dwelling unit, right?
Correct. Right now, we're working under state law. When the ADU accessory dwelling unit ordinance gets adopted and becomes effective, then that will supersede whatever's in ENZO, whatever's in, except in the coastal zone, right? The coastal zone, because that ordinance amendment would also have to go to the coastal commission. So,
But it will be important for us to have expressed our
correct.
community desires in that point in time,
Now,
right now. Okay,
Yes.
very good. Okay. And then jumping all around here, back to the food trucks. Within this report, we're just talking about on private property. We're not talking about the public right of way. Is that correct?
correct.
Okay, so that's another issue for another day.
Yes, that's the city attorney's office working on a separate and parallel process.
Okay, very good. And in terms of neighborhood markets and the CUP, because of the penchant for mixed use and the way we're envisioning what downtowns are like, or what residential/commercial zones are like, I know some of the concerns that came up in some of the recent Milpas convenience store openings were things about alcohol, tobacco sales, that type of thing. Will those fall under CUPs? Or is that hard to say at this point in time? Is that an ad hoc situation?
I can say that originally, when we went to the joint committee, there was discussion about having alcohol sales as part of a neighborhood market require a CUP, and the joint committee pretty universally, I'm sure if it's unanimous, but a great majority said no, we don't need a CUP for alcohol sales. So that was eliminated. So it's not part of the restrictions. There is a separate effort going on that's being led by the city administrator's office to perhaps require a CUP for off-sale alcohol sales, right, from liquor stores. And whatever happens in that process would supersede, that would take effect for neighborhood markets as well. So
yeah, that's universally just alcohol sales.
yes, that would be a kind of a citywide off-sale alcohol CUP or some sort of additional processing requirement that's being investigated right now.
Well, I do know that even the ABC has proximity regulations and that type of thing, but I know that just having heard those developments on Milpas, even though that isn't necessarily a residential zone, about here we go again, and how that CUP process might be either strengthened or changed or whatever. But I was just imagining, we've been talking about traffic and circulation with neighborhood markets, but that part is kind of the glaring thing I think that would come up.
Yes, and it could be that through the CUP process, if we're talking about a neighborhood market in a single family zone, that it could be that the decision makers put a special restriction on alcohol sales as an ad hoc thing, but it's not part of a requirement that's proposed right now.
And Ms. Brooke, were you looking to weigh in on that? Oh, okay. Very good. To the CBD expansion, because we were talking about it, obviously making it more user-friendly in terms of business development outside of the current CBD. But one of the issues with that is going to be what happens to the residential parking that surrounds the CBD. As that parking requirement lessens, and that's always been the rub, I think, before in planning, is more and more of the residential areas, especially up in the Sola area or certainly west of, or north of Santa Barbara Street. People we end up going into residential parking permit systems, and so that to me has always been kind of that community discussion that's gone on about what the parking restriction should or should not be in those areas.
Yes, and do you want to talk a little bit? I'm going to have Dan Gullett from Transportation talk about this particular issue.
Mr. Gullett.
Good afternoon, Chair Rouse. So Danny brought up the map of the proposed CBD expansion, and just to go into the thinking behind it. Essentially, we were looking at expanding into commercial zones within 2 blocks of public parking facilities, so structures and lots. So areas where we can reasonably assume that people will walk, so you can park in the shared parking facility and walk to these other uses.
And they become part of the zone of benefit for the PBIA purposes?
They become part of the 1 per 500 blanket parking requirement in the CBD. So the zones of benefit are separate. So we're not proposing any changes to the zones of benefit.
Right, except that as I recall, everybody in the CBD or in the 1 to 500 is within a zone of benefit on some level. Is that true or not true?
That's not true.
That's
So
not true.
on the outskirts, you're not within a zone of benefit. So for the benefit of the public and others, zones of benefit are additional reductions in the 1 per 500 square foot parking for lots that are very close to public parking lots. So if you own a property that's on the same block as a public parking lot, you don't have to provide any parking at all. And the further away you get from that lot, the more parking you have to provide up to the 500 square feet, which is what we see on the edges, and which is what we would see in all of these expansion areas. So that, and since 1996, we've had a provision in the zoning ordinance that allows for residential and mixed use to provide only one parking space per unit in the central business district. So that would remain. The Housing Task Force is exploring that further right now, but there would be no change to that. But this would allow other properties to apply that provision to reduce residential parking.
All righty. Thank you.
Rouse, if I could ask the ordinance committee, we only have Planning Commission Chair Higgins for another 10 minutes.
Okay.
So if there are certain subject matters, perhaps like the parking for food service, that you wanted to ask for any questions of him, if we could do that sooner, that would be great.
Anybody want to ask Chair Higgins one of those "what were you thinking" questions?
No, thank you.
Mr. Hotchkiss, Mr. Higgins, if you would please.
Quick question. Why did we settle on the 250 square feet per parking place? I mean, just is it a roll of the dice or arbitrary? What was the criteria for that?
Thank you for that question, Councilmember Hotchkiss. We, out of the 18 hours of hearing we had outside of the workshops, just the 3 planning commission hearings, I'm going to suggest that probably 12 of those were related to this item. A lot of public comment, a lot of discussion. So it was far from a roll of the dice. It simply comes down to, if you look at your staff report on page 2, section A, lists the 7 objectives of this effort. All 7 of them line up with the 1 for 250. I don't think any of those objectives line up with 1 for 125, which is increasing the parking burden. And it comes down to, really, if you were to go through the process on any particular project and apply the metrics that we landed on, you'd probably arrive at the 1 for 250 yourself. For example, just by way of a picture's worth 1,000 words, the Handlebar Coffee project on De La Vina is a really great example of a non-conforming property to all kinds of standards: flood control, parking, stormwater, fire code, you name it. These guys wanted to just get into that, what used to be a grocery store and is now, or most recently, a mattress store, and put a cafe in there. And to meet what is now the current requirements, they just don't have it. They happen to have a fairly large parking lot on the property, but rather than go through a mod, or rather than not go forward with the project, they decided to try to reclassify the property as restaurant rather than what's now called fast food. Fast food is 1 for 100 parking, and restaurant is 1 for 250, or the 1 for 3 seats, or whatever it is. And so they basically decided to put a kitchen in where they didn't want one. They didn't have to have a kitchen, but that lowered the parking demand on the non-conforming building. And that, to me personally, is a great illustration of what you create when you cause these non-conformities to continue or flourish or even increase the level of nonconformity on these properties outside the CBD by increasing the parking demand for one for 100 or one for 125. And frequently with these, fast food things, the effort here is to just make it simpler. It's like a flat tax, right, for your parking. Instead of an IRS code, in our zoning ordinance that says, well, if you do this kind of retail or this kind of service or that kind of fast food or bakery this or that, or have to put the menu for your restaurant on the front sheet of your construction documents. Right, let's just make it an easier, more predictable routine to follow. 1 for 250 gets it. We're seeing a lot of the public speakers that came reinforced what we already anecdotally know to be that a lot of people that go to restaurants are not driving their cars anymore. They're using ride-sharing services. That was a part of the discussion for sure. So simply, now the ride-sharing service is not found in the general plan. It's not found in the objectives in your staff report. That was a consideration of us. But if you look at what we're trying to accomplish with this NZO, the 1 for 250 hits all 7 of your objectives. So,
And do you feel, Chair Higgins, do you feel that those new restrictions will adequately protect the surrounding residential zones in terms of parking incursion?
Well, that is the nature of the decision we made. We simply thought that the impact, if you look at the properties and projects that come through, if they're going to play this game with the building department, planning department, where they designate some of their property kitchen, some of it fast food, and they really move the seats around and they're playing this game. At the end, you're really going to end up with a 1 for 200 ratio. So making it a 1 for 250 isn't that great of a leap in terms of the actual impact on neighborhoods. Is it have the likelihood of putting more cars on the street? It does, but it also, when you filter that through what the objectives of the NZO are and the likelihood of these cars hitting the streets when it's a restaurant use between 11 and 1 or between 5 and 8:30 p.m., it's not a 24-hour impact. It will put a couple more cars on the street, but against all of these other constructs in the NZO with making it more predictable and easier to understand and allowing adaptive reuse of buildings and cleaning up nonconformities, that's how we landed.
And the last question I had for you, and I think you touched on earlier about the effect on the pipeline currently in the permitting process and the potential cutoff, which to me would be how much control did the applicant have versus how much control did the applicant not have by what happened either internally in the process, amount of expense, time, the sense of fairness. And what was your conclusion that you personally came to?
I was, having been a practitioner in things like this and worked for people that are trying to get their, investments, sort of the risk reduced as quickly as you can with an entitlement. My personal opinion was to make it as early in the process as possible, so application complete. That was the split, though. So the approval just puts too many things at risk for people. And given that I have to believe what Mr. Cato says is true, where the effort here is to make the process a little bit easier to implement. So it wasn't a huge decision for us either way. It was split, but in other words, the incentive is there probably for applicants to want to use the new code, but they ought to have a choice. If they have some nuance within their square footage of their open space or whatever it is, having to go back through the process with their architects and their civil engineers to recalculate everything, or back through the construction document process, it's expensive. And what's the net result? Was the standard that was used in our previous code that bad, resulting in that egregious of a sort of a problem? I don't think it was. So that's where I personally landed.
Thank
you.
That
makes any sense.
Any further questions for Chair Higgins? Okay, very good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions for staff? All right, very good. Well, I would entertain a motion if one is ready to be entertained.
There's no public comment?
I don't think there's any further public comment. Unless Mr. Sweeney would like to come up and add in his 2 cents, since he's a big part of our design review process. We'd appreciate that, Mr. Sweeney.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Rouse, committee members, thank you for the opportunity to speak. First of all, I want to really compliment this whole process. It's been arduous 2 years, but now we have a base document to work from, and has been outlined by Mr. Cotto that, yes, things will now change on top of this document, but now we have a new document, or will have a new document to work from. One of the things that this document does for the single-family design board is that it does put more emphasis on our ability to deal with neighborhood compatibility and neighborhoods. One of the challenges that we have is I don't believe that we have a good avenue for defining what is a neighborhood, what constitutes a neighborhood, and what constitutes neighborhood compatibility. Right now, that rests on the shoulders of the existing members of each review board and their own interpretations. I understand you probably are going to get an appeal of one of our decisions sometime in September. And that appeal is going to deal with a property that's in a neighborhood. And I can tell you, in the hearings that we had on that project, many members of the neighborhood had a completely different idea of what their neighborhood consisted of and how it was defined. It was different than the applicant. And then it turns out it was different than each of the 7 members that sit on the board. So that's going to be a very big challenge, particularly when we have to deal with hedges, as we did yesterday, et cetera. So the definition of neighborhood is going to be critical as we move forward. And then the definition of compatibility, that will be another big issue as it moves forward. And then I think the other piece that will have some impact could be this neighborhood market issue in the residential areas, because they're going to sit next to single family or single unit situations. So I think that could be an issue. Can you imagine a neighborhood market at the corner of Las Olivas and Laguna Street? Can you imagine a neighborhood market at the corner of Foothill Road and Alomar? So I think those are the things that we all need to think about. If we had a city that was purely made up of square blocks, the definitions and all the things we're talking about would probably be far easier, but we don't have a city like that. So that's the challenge. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll allow Chris Barnes to come forward, that post-hearing comment. And you have 2 minutes, please.
Thank you for the last-minute opportunity. Wasn't planning on speaking. Thank you for all the hard work that's gone into this. And excuse me, please, for being so ill-prepared and coming in at the last minute, pretty much not knowing what I'm talking about. But on the new zoning ordinance, there is no such thing in Santa Barbara called a mobile home zone. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. But I did hear something that was referred to as SH senior zone.
That is a zone. Yes, that's what's one of the.
You can just address us, and we'll get ask Mr. Cotto.
Okay. And then, is there such a thing as putting that overlay on, say, for example, the Flamingo Mobile Home Park?
Okay, once again, go ahead and complete your comments.
That's
and
it.
we'll,
That's
okay.
it.
All right. Very good.
That's my comment or question.
And well, Ms. Barros, I know that you're concerned that the property's for sale,
right?
And you don't want it to change. And we're talking about removing the AUD overlay from it through the mobile home ordinance, not so much the AUD ordinance, because that's sort of temporary at this point. But that's the point for perhaps our city attorney, that you'd like protection, as much protection as possible on that property. Thank you,
Mr. Vincent.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, it's my understanding that, well, I know that the ENZO process is not specifically addressing mobile home zoning. There is a separate zoning effort that the city attorney is proceeding with regarding mobile home regulations and and so I would expect that any process that's responsive to Ms. Barnes's comments would be coming out of that process, not out of the ENZO. The ENZO had, as you know, a defined set of parameters of what site-specific or what use-specific regulations were going to be changed in the ENZO versus others that might be affected, at some future date. And so, at this time, the ENZO does not have changes proposed that address the commenters' comments.
So, Mr. Chair, thank you. Mr. Vincent, though, is there something called a senior? Is that what you were saying? A senior overlay? What was that?
Well, Mr. Chair and Committee Member Murillo, I'm not sure what the names are. The names are less important than what the regulations are. And what I would say is that whether it's done as an overlay zone, whether it's done as a separate zoning that regulates a particular use, those are provisions that will be addressed by Mr. Kalan's efforts regarding mobile home park regulations. But as far as I wouldn't get too hung up on whether it's a particular name, a senior name or something like that, or if it's mobile home. The regulations will address the types of uses, and we understand that this is a mobile home park today. I don't know whether the particular mobile home park would qualify as a senior housing scenario because of the nature of who is living there at this time, because presumably I wouldn't want to presume that all of the members are seniors. Don't know. They may be, though. But my point today is the ENZO is doing nothing to change that particular situation. Those changes will come through Mr. Kalan's efforts regarding mobile home parks.
I'd just like to appreciate Ms. Barrow sitting through the whole hearing. And also, you have 3 council members hearing your concern for the affordable housing that you live in. Thank you.
So, Ms. Barrows, if I can suggest maybe you can speak to Mr. Vincent about city attorney contact information, and they're very good about keeping people like you apprised for that kind of thing.
Thank you.
All right. Or maybe Mr. Buell. Then maybe that's the way to go. Thank you, Mr. Buell. All right. Very good. If there are no further questions of staff, I would entertain a motion if the committee's ready.
Mr. Chair, before any of the committee members make a motion, I want to remind the committee that staff has asked for direction on the issue of at what point in time may applicants continue with the existing ordinance provisions. And that dovetails right into what I'm going to jump into, which is addressing the requests of the Wright family regarding their application. The way I see it is that there are 3 different options these 2 issues are resolved at the same time. The committee could consider and just continue with staying with the recommendation of the Planning Commission regarding the ENZO. That at this time is that applicants only those applicants that have actually received approvals may continue with the current zoning. You have discussed a second option, which is deemed complete. That second option would enable the Wright family to continue because their application has at this time been deemed complete. However, it may have they could get to the end point where that project is built. However, that might result, or that would result, in potentially non-conforming uses on that site, which then would raise issues of could they change out those uses as easily as they might want. The third option that was requested by the Wright family in their letter would be that the Ordinance Committee directs staff in the ENZO process to accommodate the proposed uses that are currently allowed under their existing zoning on that site. That would require a change to the proposals in the ENZO. And this is the point in time to do that because, as Mr. Cato explained, your recommendation going to the City Council will recommend a whole package of zoning ordinance amendments to the Council. The Council's action, what staff is asking the Council to do in that package, is not only make the ENZO amendments that would be effective in Title 30, as he explained, the new zoning ordinance title. But that package would also include the proposed amendments that will be submitted to the Coastal Commission for effect within the coastal zone. So that's the reason I'm interrupting your vote prior, is I want to make sure that you understand that what's being asked, that to address these issues today.
So the Title 28 goes away altogether. There's not two separate titles for the coastal zone and for the inland areas?
The plan would be that ultimately there will be two separate titles. Title 30 for the inland areas, and the Title 28, or maybe some other number. So as we were sitting here, I was hearing Mr. Cotto's first explanation of the number change.
Yeah.
And I was realizing, well, if we carry on with the coastal zone as Title 28, all of those references to historical correspondence and so forth are going to be referring to Title 28, which will also be an old ordinance. But the point is, ultimately, staff is going to end up, we're recommending to council that there will be two separate zoning ordinances.
Right.
One for the upland, one for the coastal zone. The coastal zone number is to be determined. The upland zone would be Title 30, at least that's what's recommended now. And then the last question is, how do you want to address this issue with the M1 change? You could go forward with the legal nonconforming. That would be a matter of having deemed complete. And otherwise, it would be a different direction to tell us to accommodate those uses on that particular site.
Mr. Chair, thank you so much. I'm not sure how appropriate it is to be considering one property owner's issues here. I think any project that is in the okay, let me start. I like the application completeness. So if someone is at that stage, the right family or whoever they are, in this very important process, we need to give them the respect and accommodation for their project to go forward. So that's where I am with that. And the coastal zone issue complicates it, but they have a property that's in the coastal zone, and so they're going to have to go through that process. So that's where I am with that. I'd like to push forward everything except the mobile vending has me pausing. Mr. Cato, was using the word gourmet, and there's taco trucks, and they're not gourmet. They're just good, inexpensive, delicious food on the east side and the west side, and those are small businesses. And so I appreciate what you're saying, Ms. Brooke, about the brick and mortar restaurants, but I think that's a bigger discussion that the City Council should consider, with input from more of the public about those. So they aren't trucks that are at the wineries. They're in the low-income neighborhoods, and a lot of them are after hours, and so they aren't competing with the restaurants. But I get your point about the 4 hours, because that's generally people get off of work and they go eat the tacos later in the evening, after the traditional dinner hour at the brick and mortar restaurants. So I'd like to pull that out and vote separately, right? Because I don't want to say that I approve of 90 days and 4 hours. So help me on how we would put that forward. And then just a comment about the central business district and expanding it. We need flexibility right now in what we're doing downtown. Retail is changing. It's a huge issue. We want to put some housing down there. And if the expansion of that seems appropriate to give us more flexibility in business and enterprise and commerce, and also the 250 square foot, the one space per 250 square feet in the food service. So I think that's also accommodating change, which we're experiencing and will experience more in the future. So you were concerned about that. So I just wanted to say that when I heard the word flexibility, I was like, yes, that's exactly what we need in the downtown business core. So I'm for everything. I have a little hesitation about the outdoor open space, but I think if there's between now and July for the city council to get more information on that, the multifamily outdoor space thingy. So I'm going to let that float, to the next decision point. So that's where I'm at, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Well, if I make a similar exception, it would be with the neighborhood markets, because I don't think that that's a good idea. But the rest of this, I'm pretty much set to move forward on. If that was your motion, you wanted to pull out the food truck thing, right?
Mobile vending.
And vote separately on that.
Right. Well,
And
first of all,
votes-
we need to give directions on the application or the pipeline.
Completeness is the way I would go.
All right.
I move that the ordinance committee recommend application completeness related to the projects in the permitting process.
I agree.
Okay. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All right.
Carries. All right. So that's direction for staff on that.
Was that enough? Was that okay?
Okay. Now the next thing would be to the staff recommendations.
Did you have a list?
They're right there on the.
We just do an A, B, and C here, or what?
Chair,
There's a lot of stuff here. I would suggest we take this one item at a time. So as to item A, committee.
Oh, yeah, that's an easy one. I move recommendation A related to the airport zoning, the specific Plan 9, Veronica Meadows. I'm sorry. Do you have a recommendation, Mr. Vincent? Or just to say, I move recommendation A related to Title 28, 29, 22, and 27? Is that good?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, with your first action already, the application deemed complete. That's different direction, and staff will follow that. With that direction already in place, you could recommend, you could make a motion that you approve the recommendations A, B, and C. The only point I would make differently is that if the committee wanted to direct staff to not simply allow the Wright family project to go forward on and potentially non-conforming use, but to actually change the proposal for the M1 zoning to address that site and the allowed uses that are currently on that site.
I think we voted on that already.
Yeah.
We said deemed complete, and what may after that is what we voted on. I think we were clear on that, Mr. Vincent.
I know I'm clear that you voted on deemed complete. I'm hearing what you want to say regarding the effect of that. I'm okay with that in mind. Then you could at this stage, with what Councilmember Murillo just stated at her intentions on that first vote, then you could make a motion adopting that we approve the staff recommendations, A, B, and C.
Even with my hesitation about the mobile vending suggestion and Councilmember Hotchkiss's hesitation about neighborhood markets?
Yeah. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I think the easiest way, because there's so much more than just those two issues embedded within these two recommendations. I think you can make a motion that would approve those recommendations with comments from Councilmember Murillo and Councilmember Hotchkiss regarding their particular issues.
I concur.
You comfortable with that?
I am.
Is that good for staff to go forward? And that's what you do with Planning Commission all the time, right?
Yes, we will convey, Commissioner Murillo, your concerns about the mobile food vendor, and Councilmember Hotchkiss, your concerns about the neighborhood markets. But I would like some clarification, Councilmember Hotchkiss. Is it only in the single-family zones that you don't want to have mobile food? Neighborhood markets, or do you feel like neighborhood markets should not be allowed anywhere in the city? I'm not clear on.
I thought we were talking residential zones. Where else would you foresee them?
Well, they're allowed in commercial. I mean, they would be allowed in commercial zones as well. But the main thing is for residential zones, right?
Yes.
Single family, R2, R3, and R4.
Yeah, correct.
So just
Single-family zones. is
So
what I'm
you don't
talking
want them in single family zones.
Correct.
But the other zones are okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, we can convey that very clearly.
Mr. Chair, can I just, if we can have a conversation, me and Councilmember Hotchkiss. So, Mr. Hotchkiss, you don't see the benefit of, where you live, and you don't want to drive all the way to Ralph's to get something, and, you can just walk to something nearby.
No, I don't see.
It prevents people from driving around in their cars.
I don't want to change the nature of a neighborhood. And putting, we universally agreed that short-term rentals change the nature of a neighborhood. And I think we could universally agree that another commercial venture comparable to that in the neighborhood would also change it. So I think that universally we should not have that.
I live on the west side, and we walk all the time to our little store. It's just so convenient. I guess that's
it is convenient, and if I lived there, I would agree. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about not preserving existing, but changing it. And I don't want to change it.
I'm saying that my residential neighborhood still feels residential, even though there's a neat little convenience store nearby.
Well,
but I get your point, and I just wanted to engage you a little bit.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that does bring up a question, though, about the nature of single-family neighborhoods and businesses in general, because we've talked specifically about neighborhood markets, but we also have, bringing up the STRs, but also about businesses in general. If you open up as a professional and you start have employees or receiving clients, you're no longer in a residential use, you're in a business use. So is this specifically to neighborhood markets, or is this about the ability to have a business establish a business within a residential neighborhood?
This is really about the neighborhood market specifically.
Yeah.
The current ordinance allows a home business. We call it a home occupation. And the ENZO carries that forward and clarifies a little bit about the types of things that you are and are not allowed to do in a home occupation. But it's largely the same as the current restrictions.
Or you're not supposed to receive clients, have employees, and so
Well,
on.
it's not that you are allowed to have clients. You're not allowed to have employees. That's what it says in our current code.
Okay.
And you could have employees, but they all have to live there, right? It would be a little bit unusual situation, right? But it's supposed to be for a home office sort of idea. Let's say there was an architect had their home office, and they could receive clients in their home office. It's not supposed to be. There's no really way to regulate it, but it's not.
Yeah, I
supposed
just
to
didn't
be
want to get down the
a huge
slippery
thing.
slope of converting,
Right.
primarily residential neighborhoods into mixed use.
Right, and that's not the case. It would be really no different than what you see now as far as home businesses go, home occupations.
We talked about that a lot,
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, at the subcommittee level.
Good place to talk about that.
So can I make a motion
Yeah,
then?
Mr. Hotchkiss has
Oh,
his
sorry.
light on. Did you have a?
No, just to amplify. The kind of use you're talking about, as architect occasionally has somebody come in. You're not going to be able to police that or enforce it one way or the other if you didn't allow it. It's perfectly allowable. We have guests coming to your house all the time anyway.
Yeah, and that's the point. What we tried to do in the ENZO process, and maybe Councilmember Muir remembers this, we tried to balance between the new paradigm of the home offices versus what's the effect on the neighborhood.
Right.
Right, and we're trying to, recognize that this is happening, but also put protections in for the neighbors.
Yeah, that seems to be real flexibility in what you've proposed. I'm fine with that.
Okay.
Ms. Murillo.
So I move staff recommendation A, B, and C with the comments from individual ordinance committee members to go forward to the city council.
Second.
Okay. Is that good with staff?
Did you have any comments, Mr. Rouse, since
I'm all
Frank and I
commented
have
on.
been piping up about stuff?
Now you guys usually do. No.
Danny's just in disbelief. He can't believe he got it through.
No.
Is this good?
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Motion carries, and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, staff.
Thank you very much.